Hi everyone, I'm Andrew Elliott. I was the module coordinator for Heroes and Villains last year, and this year it's going to be Paul Williamson. I'm just wanted to introduce or record this little short introduction because the video that you're about to see that follows this was recorded last year before the pandemic. It was just I happened to be away. So there'll be instances in that video where I refer to things like seminars or dates or timelines or housekeeping elements that are no longer true. So just wanted to say, rather than starting in the middle of nothing and out of context, I'm really looking forward to delivering some of the lectures for this module. I hope you enjoy the video. If there's anything that doesn't make sense, please do get in touch with either me or Paul Williamson as the module coordinator. So thanks for your attention. I guess it's over to me. I assume or I hope by now, unless something has gone badly wrong, the Blackboard site is set up. So you should be able to go there and see a series of documents. There'll be the standard module guide, which will be in a recognizable format, except that I've given lots of set readings and alternative films for each week. So you're really encouraged to access those, to watch as many films as you can as part of the module. You will also have a week by week guide to the schedule, which just tells you the date, the topic of the lecture, who's doing the lecture, what the set reading will be, and what the set film will be. There are no formal screenings as such. So the screenings, I've chosen films that are all widely available. Generally, they're also available through Box of Broadcasts, and if you don't know what that is, there is a guide to using Box of Broadcasts back on the Blackboard site. But it's fairly straightforward, and you can access all of those. And they do have DVD versions of them in the library as well. So I think I've set those to one-day loans, so you can all access them, hopefully. There are a series of set readings which I expect you to have read every single week. You can do it however you want to do it. They're all available from the outset of the module, so you could actually just go through and read them all this week if you fancy doing that, and then you'll be ahead of the game. I would strongly recommend doing that if you have the option. All those set texts are available again through Blackboard as well as through the Talent Aspire reading list. That seems to have worked pretty well in the last few years. If anything's not working, let me know. Again, I release all of those at the beginning of the module because I want you to engage with it at your own pace and however you work best. Again, we're going to be expecting every week that you'll have read the reading for the seminar and you'll have watched the core film. If you have any problem accessing those, please do let me know. There's also, as with any third year module, there's a lot of independent reading which we're expecting you to do. So we usually say, about sort of 2 to 3 hours extra a week of independent reading. I would advise you not to take that as some kind of set in stone idea that you must follow and you must keep your watch next to you at all times, but actually just to be curious. Just read as widely as you can in as much time as you have. The more you read, the more you'll find yourself engaging with the questions that we're asking you throughout the module. As regards questions, modes of assessment, I know that people very often get freaked out by this. It sounds very easy for me to say this, but please don't worry. I tend to, and if you've spoken to students who've taken this course in previous years, they will tell you I tend to release the essay questions a little bit later. I know that means that I'm not very popular for doing that. However, I do genuinely have a very good pedagogical reason for doing so. I want you to just engage with the questions. I want you to think about the films, and I want you to think about what those films mean, why a given hero is understood to be a given hero at any set moment. We also have a series of individual presentations, and these are entirely voluntary. So I can see most of you sitting back in your chairs thinking, well, I'm not going to do one. The reason that we have these presentations is because I don't like having multiple assessed points. I don't like group presentations at level 3. But your essay, which is 100% of the module, is going to be 3,500 words due in January. So I'll make it the latest possible point in the module. There's again a reason for that, is that some people like it earlier, some people like it later. So if you want to get it done before Christmas, there is nothing stopping you doing that. I will open up the essay submission and you can just submit it and then not think about it again. If you're more of a slow burner, let's say, and you want to submit it much later, then by all means you're free to do that, and it'll be I think it's the 8th of January. Again, it's listed in the module guide already. So those are the assessment points. The formal assessment point is just one essay. So there are two reasons then that I like to do presentations. One is to give you a chance at doing textual analysis, at really reading a given clip very, very closely and applying some set reading to understanding that clip. You should be fairly familiar with that so far, and therefore the presentation should be a breeze. They're usually about 5 minutes at the beginning of a seminar. The other thing I've been experimenting with recently is doing precisely what I'm doing now, of making video clips, and maybe that's a skill that would be really useful for the future, I'm guessing. But if you want to do that, you're welcome to do that, and just send it through to me. I promise I won't put it online and publish it elsewhere. The other reason, or the sort of the carrot on the stick of why you might want to do an individual presentation that is entirely voluntary, is not only to practice, but also because if you want to choose your own essay question, I'm very happy for you to choose your own essay question. But if you do want to do your own essay question, you've got to submit an individual presentation that will just prove to me that you're able to work independently, and that there's nothing that I need to sort of supervise there. So I do demand that you do an individual presentation if you want to choose your own essay question. Otherwise, these set essay questions will be released usually about week 6 or week 7. So the big question here is, what is the module about? And it is about 3 things predominantly. It's about analysis, therefore reading films, really closely reading those films, so sort of 30 seconds, 1 minute of screen time, and really analyzing what that means. Second is about contextualization, so understanding what you obviously know, but that films don't appear in a vacuum. They appear in a given set cultural, political, philosophical context. So what I want you to be thinking about is the ways in which that film relates to the given context in which it's released, the given time period, and the values and so on, and then reading backwards and reading what those values might be. So in some ways this module is a bit of a history module as well as it is a film module, because I want you to be thinking about a film that's released in 1955. What's happening in the background? Which country's making it? We're looking predominantly at a Hollywood film, but who's making it? Why? Is it a genre film? Does it use a particular star? Can you use any other theoretical constructs in order to explore how that film is made, and therefore what the logic of that film is? And so we use heroes and villains as a way of contextualizing those. If someone is considered to be heroic, that tells us a little bit about the values and mores of that given era. And it's also about reading. It's about pushing yourself and challenging yourself to think carefully, to choose something new and innovative that you might have encountered before, and then apply that to a given film. So while we're viewing it through this tripartite prism of analysis, contextualization, and reading, I want us to think very carefully about what we actually mean by something like the word hero. It's a very common word, and what we mean by villain, again, a very common word. What we're not going to be looking at, and this is my third and final disclaimer for this introductory lecture, is we're not going to be looking at superheroes for 12 weeks. For a number of reasons. Superhero films are actually a very, very recent phenomenon. They may be particularly popular. I think their popularity is seeming to sort of wane a little bit now, but they are, in respect of film history, as you'll remember from your first year, actually a very recent phenomenon over the last 20 years or so. The other reason is that they are quite problematic when you start to think about hero mythology, because hero mythology has a tendency towards the conservative with a small c. It also has a tendency towards the fetishization of specific positions of privilege, specific kind of models of power, and that tends to be white, straight, able-bodied, middle-class or upper-class men. And so when we're looking at the superhero mythology, which picks up on that and amplifies it, very often we'll be looking at, as we'll talk about in week 6 or 7, whenever it is we talk about hero myths in superhero films, they do tend towards a very specific and narrow reading of what it means to be a hero. So what do we mean by hero generally? A lot of the definitions that we would use emerged through literary criticism from the 1960s and 1970s, and they're then picked up and developed through mythography, which is a a discipline which emerges from literary criticism, but looks at comparative myths. So myths from, say, Native American myths compared with Greek myths, compared with Hindu myths, and so on. And that comparative mythology allows you to understand that there are certain universal patterns, and we'll talk about those in a moment. So mythography is a way, literally mythography means writing myth, is a way of understanding myth as a process of thinking through the world. It also, of course, has impacts and branches in theology, in philosophy, in film studies and adaptation theory, because to understand who the hero is and who the protagonist of a given film is, if you think about it, it's quite a complex idea. If you look at almost any Hollywood film, it's not just Batman, Joker, Christopher Nolan elements. If you look at any Hollywood film, you'll see that the ways in which we identify the hero of a given film actually have a lot to do with things like narrative structure or plot or sujet or favula, and we're going to talk about those terms in a moment. They are an instinctive ability to understand who or for whom we're supposed to be rooting throughout the film. Traditionally, if we look at a guy called Joseph Campbell, who wrote a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and we'll look at that book in a moment in more depth, what he defines as the hero is a really interesting one. He calls the hero the man or woman who's been able to battle past his personal and local historical limitations to the generally valid, normally human forms. And if we think about that definition, that means what we're talking about is a specific person, not an object, an idea, or an ideal, the man or the woman, who has been able to battle past his personal limitations. So those limitations are not only personal, but locally, contextually, historical. I apologize for the multiple adverbs there, but they are limitations that stop him or her from doing something. And so what we see, part of the definition of hero is this friction, this limitation, this battle that someone must overcome limitations. So you've got to battle past them or overcome them to the generally valid, normally human forms. This precludes superhero films. They should be normally human forms. If someone is a superhero and can fly and they come across an obstacle in a pathway and they can fly over it, that's not a particularly exciting story. So it's got to be a challenge, and that means it's got to be normally human in terms of its forms, or in terms of the forms of those limitations. So that's what Joseph Campbell talks about in terms of his hero with 1,000 faces, in which he outlines an idea of a nuclear unit of monomyth. And again, we'll come back to that term in just a moment. So when we're looking at the hero, what we see is the hero must contain all of the virtues of humankind, must be able to redeem, protect, or serve society in some way. They must use those skills that they've learned to overcome those norms in order to serve society for the good. Now, if we think about that, what that means for the greater good, right? We think the good must be something that we all agree on. And if you think about political climate today, for example, there is very little that we would actually all agree is universally good or bad. There will always be different ideas about good or bad. So what we're looking for is a hero who will overcome specific limitations in order to uncover the universal good. Now, if we can define hero in this way, what does it mean when we define the villain? The villain is an interesting concept because it's not actually a concept that really exists. It's very slippery, it's very difficult, it's very ephemeral and transient. We can't ever put our finger on exactly what it means. Usually, it is, if you consider most villains through literature and through their literary forms, as Campbell argues, they are the person who embodies the absence of all of those heroic values. Right? So if the hero, it contains all of the virtues, the villain doesn't contain all the vices, but is simply the opposite, the person who misses all of those, who lacks all of those. And so we see that the hero and villain, the definition is actually based on virtues and values. So we have to go back one level to look at the societal level. And if we look at that societal level, we can see that the virtues and values of any given society are rooted within that society. So if there is a group of people who think, for example, that infant exposure, to take the sort of the Spartans, the practice of when a baby is born, if they are not exactly what you're looking for, you would leave them out on the hillside, expose them to nature. In essence, you're effectively killing them. that would be deemed to be perfectly normal as a particular practice of a given era, which we would now consider to be totally abhorrent, completely barbarian or barbaric, and we would reject that. So those virtues and values are very much coded within a given era. At the same time, of course, there will be other cultures who would look at the ways in which we conduct warfare, for example, nowadays through drones or through non-specific targets, military targets, which can include civilians, and many would call those practices barbaric, would call those practices inhumane, and so on. Yet they have been sort of accepted as the ways in which we, and I say we in a very specific Western sense, we in the West would defend ourselves from terrorism or whatever. Again, there is no value judgment. I'm not attaching any value judgment here. I'm just saying that actually the virtues and values of any given society are tied very much with what we specifically at that moment deem to be good or pure or true or noble or laudable or something that we'd like to strive towards. So what we see is that when we're looking at heroes and villains, we very quickly move away from this idea of plot and subject. We move away and into the level of sociology. So once we start to define the hero in terms of sociology, we end up in very complex territory. So the other way we can look at it is looking at the more common, perhaps, understanding of the word hero, and that hero would be, as Dean Miller calls it in The Epic Hero, the hero simply of a story, tale, poem, folktale, myth, or religion, who becomes a role model, which provides a template to follow. And you can see already in his third definition here, there is already, though, this idea that there is someone who will risk their life for a greater ideal, which sends us back to that idea of good, true, pure sort of nobility and so on. And again, the villain, logically and structurally, is not simply something that exists on its own, but something simply that reflects the absence of those virtues. What this means then is from the very outset, we see that the hero and the villain are codependent. If one contains all of the values and virtues, the other is dependent on that hero in order to define their villainy. If we don't know what a hero is, we don't know what the villain is. So if we start off looking at Mike Alsford, which again is the set text I mentioned in the introduction to this, Mike Alsford's Heroes and Villains, already on page 2, he talks about this codependence as the ways in which heroes and villains can be seen as the same. And in that piece, he says, interestingly, that images of the hero and their villainous counterparts have, in my view, served as iconic receptacles for a wide range of cultural values, aspirations, and fears. What a culture considers heroic and what it considers villainous says a lot about that culture's underlying attitudes. And in full disclosure, it was actually this quotation that when I was reading it back in whenever I started this module, that actually launched the ideas that became this module. I started off by thinking how interesting it was that if we look at that idea of an iconic receptacle, as that the hero doesn't exist or the villain doesn't exist in itself, but exists only as a kind of empty vessel into which we pour our own values, our own fears, hopes, dreams, aspirations, then it should in theory be possible to look at films over the course of the 20th century and understand what the hopes, dreams, fears of that society were. So it's a way of looking backwards and unpacking the heroic values and virtues. So perhaps the best way to begin looking at those virtues and values is to go back in time and look at the ways in which hero patterns started to emerge and look at some of the earliest examples of hero myths. So the earliest literary example, and I'm using literary in a very loose sense here, the earliest literary example we have is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is an Akkadian epic from around about, and this is a wild guess, but it's around about 18th century before Christ, or BCE, before the Common Era. The epic itself exists and is handed down to us as a series of fragments and fragmented tablets. So the thing that you're seeing on the screen now is a tablet with the Akkadian script on it, which is sort of pre-Sumerian, it's cuneiform, with large sections of it missing. So a lot of it is sort of pieced together from what we think might have happened and from similar myths from other times. However, what's interesting about Gilgamesh is not only is it quite an interesting story, but it begins as one of the first recorded stories of a journey. And what's happening here is Gilgamesh, who's a king, sets out with his companion, who's called Enkidu, and they set out on a journey to go and find a mythical king who lives at the top of a mountain, and to understand. It's a very long story, but I'll see if I can find some links to YouTube versions of Gilgamesh that you can sort of maybe catch up on, or you can of course read the original myth. But what's interesting is we begin the hero myths with a journey. And that's a very, very common trope. And we'll look at some of the tropes in the 7 basic plots in later lectures. But it's a very common trope for literary criticism and for the hero myths, that they begin from moving away from their status quo, from the place where they're born, the place where they grew up, and searching for something that will find an answer to a question that they have, or a solution to a problem that they have. And that question of the journey and that question of searching is a pattern that recurs again and again and again and again throughout literature. So we look at maybe some of the cosmogony myths. So those are the myths that talk about how the world came into being. If you look at cosmogonies or cosmologies, the Babylonian cosmology, the Numa Elish, which is when from on high, begins with the sky god and the land god mating and creating the earth, which is, if you think about it, a solution to a problem that we have, which is how did we come to be? How did we come to exist? These patterns start to be picked up by the Greek myths as well, and one of the most famous Greek myths of all is, of course, Homer's Odyssey and Homer's Iliad. Homer's Odyssey, perhaps just pipping the Iliad to the post, is a story about a journey. It's about the journey, of course, of Odysseus returning from the Trojan War, trying to find his way home, and the 20 years, also 10 years that it takes for him to get home, and the adventures that he uncovers along the way. Of course, that's been redone several times throughout history in terms of adaptations, and perhaps the most famous would be the Coen brothers' 2001, I think, film "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?", which is a modern update set in the Dust Bowl of America. The journey home, this perennial journey home, is a really integral part as well of the hero's development. The hero must go on some kind of journey, or whether it be a sort of literal one or a metaphorical one. And so we get this idea of movement, the idea of development, and the idea of returns as well. That's kind of key to those myths emerging. The Roman myths, many of them were simply updates or borrowings from the Greek mythology, but they developed their own terminology as well. So you've got the story of the founding of Rome, which, if you consider it, is a kind of cosmogony. It's kind of a foundation myth, as well as a question about where we come from, which has Romulus and Remus being raised by wolves and so on, hence the importance of the wolf to the images of Rome and images of the Roman Empire. Those myths that the Romans told each other, again, based very much on journeys and on individual heroes overcoming limitations, overcoming those odds in order to arrive at a solution which gives us peace and stability and so on. If we fast forward through the generations, we actually see those myths and those ideas coming up again and again and again with the stories of the Vikings, as those setting out for kinds of what they call far travel in the Viking myths or the Norse myths. Those people traveling to other distant lands and meeting monsters and insurmountable odds and unconquerable armies and new and strange forms of being, and each time they must sort of either battle them or pacify them or somehow overcome these limitations that are placed on them, these things that are stopping them from traveling or completing their journeys. Again, a few hundred years later, we have the Arthurian myths coming into being. There's most famous of course, being the quest for the Holy Grail, which again, if you think about a quest, is again a journey. It's a journey to go and find something that will solve a problem. It's a way of establishing Arthur as the rightful and legitimate king who's overcoming his specific limitations. We see that again through even the debate poetry and the fabliaux of the French medieval tradition, that would be telling stories that are kind of ribald, earthy, and humorous and jokey, but always you have a hero who's a protagonist who has a specific problem, who has to find some way of overcoming that problem in order to establish their themselves as legitimate, or in order to do a lot of the Fabio, for example, talk about marriages that have marital infidelity, and so usually the husband, who is the cuckold, has to go out and find the solution and avenge himself in some way, and usually it's a jokey and a very sort of almost pornographic in some senses way of doing that. But they also incorporate these senses of goodness and values. If you think about it, the fact that he has to avenge himself somehow tells us that we hold this value of marital infidelity as being pure and important within society. Those start to get brought into English literature, and I mean English, not British, through people like Geoffrey Chaucer, who's adapting some of these Fabio directly. And Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is, of course, a story, multiple miniature stories set around the framing device of a journey, where they're journeying on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, and these are the stories that they tell along the way. So the pilgrimage somehow is an answer to a spiritual question that they've not yet answered. Fast forward through the Renaissance, through to Shakespeare, we have these plays which talk about these grand, noble ideas about what it means to be a good king, what it means to be a noble lover, what love itself means. Very often these are set around heroes who have a specific problem. Romeo and Juliet, perhaps the most famous of them all, is a story about two lovers who have a specific quest and who have these limitations that are local limitations. So the question that Shakespeare is really asking in Romeo and Juliet is, can love conquer those local limitations, those historical limitations? And so the heroic capacity of the heroes in Romeo and Juliet are perhaps not literally a journey, but they are still in that same sense of striving towards something, striving towards a goal. As we fast forward through the intermittent centuries, we have the emergence of the novel, sort of in early 19th century invention that starts to become famous as a way of exploring a specific question. So if you think about each novel is exploring a question, what does it mean to be poor? And growing up in Victorian London would be the questions that very often Dickens is interested in. George Eliot's very interested in those social issues, those social problems. Thomas Hardy is talking about how in a very specific, let's say a very specific town, someone can overcome the limitations to become the person that embodies these perennial values. And all the way through to the 20th century and the emergence of, say, comic books and superheroes. These are stories about how we establish who we are and how we reach those values that we hold dear, whether we need some kind of supernatural intervention in order to do so. So when we look at the history of literature, which was a sort of massively fast-forwarded version through the history of literature from 2000 BC to the present day, what we find are these perennial stories emerging. And what we also find is that once you start to look at a body or bodies of literature or bodies of kind of stories, we find that patterns start to emerge. And those patterns have fascinated literary historians and myth historians for a very long time. Perhaps the most famous of these, and probably the one that you'll have encountered, is Vladimir Prop, who wrote his Morphology of the Folktale, which is where he collected together these folk tales, which were the kind of the modern versions of the Fabliaux that Chaucer and the French Fabliaux tradition were talking about. And these folk tales are stories that come from the people, the stories that we tell each other and tell ourselves and tell our children. And he studies them using a literary model called formalism, which is where you study the form and not the content of the literary devices. What he sees is that patterns emerge through these folk tales. They all share basic fundamental narrative similarities. So you'll probably have come across Prop's character functions and so on. You might get a helper and assistance and so on, and you'll get the kind of call to adventure and the resistance and so on. His Morphology of the Folktale, he uses it to prove that all folktales share a basic common form. Other people have picked up that same idea that we get formalism in culture. People like Jung, the psychologist, the psychoanalyst, talks about the ways in which, as a broader universal myth, we have a universal subconscious, he calls it, where we all imagine the same thing. And that's the way he understands the fact that these patterns emerge in stories belonging to cultures who've had nothing to do with each other. So he finds a Native American myth where they've got the trickster figure, which would be the coyote, and he finds that in French medieval texts, you very often got the picture or the image of the fox, the renard, who becomes the trickster figure. And of course, in Norse myth, as anyone who's watched Thor will know, we have the trickster figure in Loki. And he says that the only way to explain these sort of eruptions of those key figures and those patterns and similar icons is through this idea that we all share a universal subconscious. Those get individually interpreted through Freud, who was Jung's teacher. And Freud looks at the psyche, the individual psyche, and particularly the emergence of the self as a child develops, looking at the ways in which that is in itself some kind of journey, some kind of transition point from a period of innocence and vulnerability to a position of full subjectivity as an individual. Now, all of those, the Prop and the Jung and the Freud, were sort of thrown around, and they were brought together and fused together in one narrative by Joseph Campbell, the figure we've met before, in his Hero with 1,000 Faces. Now, this text was a really interesting one because what he's saying is we have the same hero. This is what the title means, obviously. We've got the same hero with 1,000 different faces. And his theory basically posits that all cultures throughout all time periods produce incessantly and insistently. They produce these heroes, these myths, these folkloric beliefs and religious beliefs which explain who we are and why we're here. And he folds religion in with this. And I'm very conscious I don't want to offend anyone here. When we talk about religion, and we will talk a little bit about religion, when we talk about religion as a myth, we're not saying it necessarily doesn't exist. But what we are saying is that these religions follow set patterns because, of course, the ways in which we talk about religion and talk about religious myths is an invention of the human brain. If you're a believer, you'll believe that the human brain has written down these divine truths. If you don't believe it, you'll believe this is an invention of the human brain and that's it. But either way, they are human framing devices for these broader narrative truths. So all of these myths, these religions, these ideas, these folkloric beliefs all explain who we are and why we're here and what we're doing here. So when he starts to piece these together into these patterns, what Campbell puts forward is what he calls the hero's journey. And this gets really, really complicated. And you should see on screen now an image of someone who's adapted this and tried to sort of explore each individual element of it. Very often these are represented as a circle because the hero's journey is fundamentally cyclical. The three elements that you really need to know, which is what he calls the nuclear unit of the monomyth, is Act 1, separation, Act 2, initiation, which is called here a supreme ordeal, but it's initiation, and Act 3 is unification or return. So what we end up with is separation, initiation, and return, where the hero begins life doing one thing, leaves that life, leaves that status quo, and goes into a new realm, the realm of initiation. They are tested, they try new things, they develop new skills, and then they return to that society and fix the ills of that given period or that society with the newfound knowledge that they've gained. And so that fundamentally is the hero's journey, and it comes in these three forms, and it always comes as separation, initiation, and return. Perhaps it's easier to understand the ways in which these cycles come and go looking at pop culture. So here's a short TEDx video explaining how it works with things like Harry Potter and in modern cultural forms.
What do Harry Potter, Katniss Everdeen, and Frodo all have in common with the heroes of ancient myths? What if I told you they are all variants of the same hero? Do you believe that? Joseph Campbell did. He studied myths from all over the world and published a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, retelling dozens of stories and explaining how each represents the monomyth or hero's journey. So, what is the hero's journey? Think of it as a cycle. The journey begins and ends in the hero's ordinary world, but the quest passes through an unfamiliar, special world. Along the way, there are some key events. Think about your favorite book or movie. Does it follow this pattern? Status quo, that's where we start. 1 o'clock, call to adventure. The hero receives a mysterious message, an invitation, a challenge. 2 o'clock, assistance. The hero needs some help, probably from someone older, wiser. 3 o'clock, departure. The hero crosses the threshold from his normal, safe home and enters the special world and adventure. We're not in Kansas anymore. 4 o'clock, trials. Being a hero is hard work. Our hero solves a riddle, slays a monster, escapes from a trap. 5 o'clock, approach. It's time to face the biggest ordeal, the hero's worst fear. 6 o'clock. Crisis. This is the hero's darkest hour. He faces death and possibly even dies, only to be reborn. 7 o'clock. Treasure. As a result, the hero claims some treasure, special recognition, or power. 8 o'clock. Result. This can vary between stories. Do the monsters bow down before the hero, or do they chase him as he flees from the special world? 9 o'clock. Return. After all that adventure, the hero returns to his ordinary world. 10 o'clock. New life. This quest has changed the hero. He has outgrown his old life. 11 o'clock. Resolution. All the tangled plot lines get straightened out. 12 o'clock. Status quo, but upgraded to a new level. Nothing is quite the same once you're a hero. Many popular books and movies follow this ancient formula pretty closely, but let's see how well The Hunger Games fits the hero's journey template. When does Katniss Everdeen hear a call to adventure that gets the story moving? When her sister's name is called from the lottery. How about assistance? Is anyone going to help her on her adventure? Hey, Mitch. What about departure? Does she leave her ordinary world? She gets on a train to the capital. Okay, so you get the idea. What do you have in common with Harry Potter, Katniss Everdeen, and Frodo? Well, you're human, just like them. The hero's journey myth exists in all human cultures and keeps getting updated because we humans reflect on our world through symbolic stories of our own lives. You leave your comfort zone, have an experience that transforms you, and then you recover and do it again. You don't literally slay dragons or fight Voldemort, but you face problems just as scary. Joseph Campbell said, "In the cave you fear to enter lies the treasure you seek." What is the symbolic cave you fear to enter? Auditions for the school play? Baseball tryouts? Love? Watch for this formula in books, movies, and TV shows you come across. You will certainly see it again. But also be sensitive to it in your own life. Listen for your call to adventure. Accept the challenge. Conquer your fear and claim the treasure you seek. And then do it all over again.
So this cyclical structure we can actually see exists in a whole range of other places, and I'm going to apply it here to this, particularly the film The Matrix. So we begin outside of the Matrix in the status quo, in the boring, bland office building which Thomas Anderson works, and that then leads to a literal call to an adventure through the old Nokias. That call to adventure leads to a form of assistance which he wasn't expecting, that comes from somewhere sort of supernatural, which then prompts his departure by taking the blue pill into the Matrix. That leads to a series of trials, initial trials where he's trying out things and trying out the new world, and his growing power leads to the approach of the evil agents. Those evil agents then bring about a crisis in which they capture Morpheus within the Matrix, and then he's trapped. So they go back from outside to the inside with literal treasure to seek a literal treasure, which in this case is the embodied form of Morpheus. That leads to a result and an initial triumph over the agents and the return of Morpheus to outside of the Matrix to the so-called real world. That then prompts the new life of Neo, that rebirth as the One, as the Messiah, who can then effect some kind of resolution. As soon as that resolution is effected, of course, he must immediately leave the Matrix, but then he goes back into the Matrix in order to return to the status quo, wherein he can save the world. So as we draw this lecture to a close, we want to pause, offer some conclusions, and think about some questions. The first of these is to recognise how pervasive the monomyth is. So in fact, when we start to look at it, these monomyths exist everywhere. So this is Super Mario Brothers Duck Hunt. We start off with the status quo, and we begin already with a sort of call to adventure. Once we start moving on, we get assistance from these little magic mushroom guys that actually you can see they're kind of helper points. This leads to the fundamental departure into the Super Mario levels. What you get here is a series of extended trials now that Mario, of course, has to figure out how to navigate this world. We start to get, as things get more and more difficult, We see we get another assistance there, another helper. As things get more and more difficult, once you've got to navigate these new worlds, we get through the trials, we get through the approach to the main crisis. The crisis point, of course, this player is doing particularly well, but the crisis point, of course, is the moment when you reach something that you can't actually achieve. Here we have the treasure. As you start to see the treasure racking up, you get the result, which will be the time bonus, and of course the moving into a new world, and that leads to a return and a new life, which eventually sort of repeats over and over again. And of course video games with each level get stuck in that cycle over and over again. You enter new worlds, you get new helpers, you figure out new departures, and you're subjected to new trials as things get more and more difficult. Each new approach gets more and more difficult. The crisis is more sort of readily available once you see the villains and sort of the level bosses, so to speak. You get more and more treasure as those crises increase, and then of course each one ends in a result that will lead you to a new life and a new resolution until eventually that returns back to the status quo. So I want to finish by drawing together the various arguments we've put forward over the course of this lecture. I see this as breaking down into essentially a problem and then some further questions that we're going to be exploring throughout the rest of the module. First of all, the problem emerges from the contradiction between two particular arguments that I've put forward, and I suspect some of you will have already spotted it now. First point is that I argued that the hero is in some senses constructed by social values, right, and the vices and virtues of each given era that will influence the ways in which we understand and treat and depict those heroes on screen. So if they're constructed by their social values, then that's one thing. The second argument put forward is that these values or these heroes and the heroic mythologies follow certain patterns and set trends that tend not to change very much over time. So we tend to see formulas repeating and repeating endlessly, fixated around formulas and around quests and around journey narratives. So if we take those two arguments together and we accept both of them, that presents a new problem for us, which is a very logical problem. It must follow then that either all societies all throughout history share all the same values, or indeed all societies across the world at any given moment share the same values, or it means that heroes must change in their formal aspects whilst retaining the same underpinning structure. Or else we have to find another way around this potential problem posed by formalism and structuralism on the one hand, and the concept of a cultural historical approach on the other. So these two problems seem like they're insurmountable, but they're really not. And so those are the questions that we're really going to start exploring throughout the module, and particularly in our seminars together, which is why I want you to do the reading for it. These problems also create a couple of questions. Those questions, first of all, are how do these arguments relate to film? Does the medium or the use of film change the heroes on offer? So, for example, if we're dealing with a Hollywood film that is trying to appeal to a specific kind of audience, then are they more or less likely to depict heroes in a certain way? Are they more or less likely to follow a set pattern? What are they planning to do with those, and how does it work? And so we'll talk about this in terms of genre films next week, and we'll also keep coming back to this idea about how Hollywood tries to depict itself. The second question is, what about the film industry, and the question or the notion that film is, of course, an industrial imperative. So if films are aimed at a global audience rather than a specifically American one, a North American one, does this new kind of audience create a new consensus of values, as in when we're exporting films to everyone across the world, do those audiences adopt and adapt to those specific kind of values? We see this with language, for example. The ways in which people speak will often reflect unconsciously the media that they're consuming. And so the question that arises then is, would the exportation of these specific values that are unique to Hollywood create a new global consensus, or does it in fact mean that all audiences are forced to adopt homogeneity or to watch as an other? Another question is, if values change over time, which we know they do, how is it that the heroic myth can survive, and not only survive but thrive so clearly in Hollywood film? And the final question is whether heroic myths draw on social values, or whether we look at it the other way and do they dictate them? So of course we know that we learn a lot of our behaviors from from the stories that we hear, the folk tales, the films, the books, the poems, and the myths that we hear. So do those heroic myths drive social values, or are they driven in turn by them? So we're going to explore all of those questions as of next week. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope it's been useful. I hope you've enjoyed my editing, which has been a little bit shoddy in places, I know, but I'm still learning. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you next week, where we'll kick off with war films. Don't forget to watch Platoon and read the set text, which will be outlined in the module guide. And we'll go straight into the seminars after that. Thank you.